She didn't remember falling asleep. Only the moment she realized someone else was holding her child. The cabin lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow, casting long shadows across rows of restless passengers. But the silence had been hard-earned, stitched together only after nearly an hour of quiet tension and whispered complaints. And Chloe Bennett had been at the center of it all, her arms aching as she clutched her 6-month-old daughter, Lily, who had cried with a desperate, piercing sound that seemed too big for such a small body. The kind of cry that made strangers shift in their seats and glance over with tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The kind that made Chloe's chest tighten with shame as she whispered apology after apology, her voice barely audible over the steady hum of the aircraft engine. "I'm so sorry. She's just tired. I'm so sorry." And she meant it. She meant every word, even though she knew no one really cared about the reason. Only the noise, only the disruption, only the inconvenience of a tired mother who clearly didn't belong in a late-night flight packed with well-dressed travelers and quiet expectations. And Chloe could feel it in the way they looked at her worn cardigan, at the frayed strap of her baby bag, at the exhaustion written into the lines beneath her eyes, because at 26 she should not have looked this tired, this defeated. But life had not asked for her permission before unraveling. Not when Lily's father walked away before she was even born. Not when the rent notice slipped under her door 3 weeks ago. Not when the job interview she had flown out for ended with a polite smile and a rehearsed rejection that echoed louder than any crying baby. And now she was here, somewhere 30,000 feet above the ground, running on maybe 2 hours of broken sleep and the kind of hope that felt thinner by the minute. And Lily just wouldn't stop crying. Her tiny fists clenched, her face flushed, her cries bouncing off the narrow walls of the cabin until Chloe felt like she might disappear under the weight of it all, until a sharp voice from across the aisle muttered something about people like that should stay home, and Chloe swallowed hard, her throat tightening as she turned her face away, blinking fast, refusing to let herself break. Not here, not now. And that was when he spoke, not loudly, not in a way that drew attention, just a calm, steady voice beside her. "Hey, would you mind if I try something?" And she looked up, startled, meeting the eyes of a man who didn't belong in economy class, not with that tailored navy suit, not with the quiet confidence in the way he sat, not with the kind of presence that made people instinctively lower their voices. And for a second she hesitated, because she had learned to be careful, learned not to trust strangers easily, especially when she was this vulnerable. But Lily's cries softened into desperate whimpers and Chloe's arms trembled with exhaustion. And something in the man's expression, calm, patient, not pitying, made her nod, just once, before carefully placing Lily into his arms. And what happened next felt almost unreal, because within moments, the crying eased, the tension drained from the tiny body, and Lily settled against his shoulder as if she had always belonged there, his large hand moving in slow, practiced circles on her back, his voice low as he hummed something soft and steady, and Chloe stared, her lips parting slightly in disbelief. "How did you?" But the words faded before she could finish, because she didn't really need an answer. Not when the quiet had already returned, not when her daughter was finally resting. And for the first time in what felt like days, Chloe allowed her own shoulders to drop, the tension slipping away inch by inch as the constant noise in her mind dimmed. And she didn't even realize how close she was leaning until it happened, until her head gently fell against his shoulder, her body giving in without permission, because exhaustion doesn't ask, it takes. And he didn't move, not even slightly. He didn't shift away or clear his throat or make it awkward. He just adjusted his posture, barely noticeable, enough to support her weight, enough to keep her from slipping, and the cabin seemed to breathe around them. The earlier irritation replaced by quiet glances and softened expressions. Even the flight attendant who had been watching from the aisle paused before approaching, her voice low as she leaned in. "Sir, I can move her if..." But he shook his head once, subtle, firm. "It's all right. Let her rest." And there was something about the way he said it that made her nod without question, stepping back into the aisle, leaving them untouched. And for a while, time seemed to slow, the rhythmic hum of the plane blending with the steady rise and fall of 2 quiet breaths, one small, one soft, both finally at peace. And he looked down, just briefly, his gaze lingering on the worn strap of her bag. The edge of a folded document peeking out, a rejection letter stamped in polite ink, and something unreadable flickered in his eyes before he looked away again, returning his attention to the sleeping child in his arms, holding her carefully, as if she were something fragile and rare, and somewhere in that quiet stretch of night, suspended above a sleeping world, Chloe Bennett finally rested, unaware that the man she leaned on was not just another passenger, and unaware that when she woke, everything she thought she knew about this flight and her future was about to change. Chloe did not wake all at once. It came in fragments. First the warmth beneath her cheek, steady and unfamiliar, then the quiet, a silence so complete it felt wrong after the chaos she remembered, and finally the realization that her arms were empty, and her eyes opened fast, panic flashing through her chest before she even lifted her head, her gaze dropping instantly to her lap, where Lily should have been, but she was not there, and for a split second the world tilted, her breath catching as every worst thought rushed in at once, until she turned sharply to the side and froze, because Lily was there, cradled securely in the arms of the same man, sleeping peacefully against his chest, her tiny fingers curled into the fabric of his suit, as if she had chosen him, and Chloe blinked, disoriented, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Oh my God, I am so sorry." The words tumbling out of her before she could stop them, her hands reaching instinctively as if to take Lily back. But she hesitated, just for a moment, because her daughter looked more settled than she had in days, her breathing slow and even, her face relaxed in a way Chloe had almost forgotten was possible, and the man glanced at her, calm, composed, as if nothing about this situation was unusual. "It is all right," he said quietly, his voice steady in a way that made her feel even more aware of how unsteady she was. She just fell asleep again, and Chloe swallowed, nodding quickly, her cheeks warming with embarrassment as she pushed a strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly aware of how she must look, how long she must have been leaning on him, how completely she had let her guard down in front of a stranger. "I did not mean to. I have not slept properly in days, and I just," she trailed off, the explanation sounding thin even to her own ears. But he did not interrupt, did not fill the silence with polite dismissal or forced reassurance. He simply shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the baby, and said, "You were exhausted." Not as a question, not even as a judgment, just a quiet acknowledgement. And something about the way he said it made Chloe pause, because it was the first time someone had stated it without expectation, without criticism, without implying that she should have handled it better, and she let out a small breath she had not realized she was holding. "Yeah," she admitted softly, her shoulders dropping a fraction, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the soft hum of the aircraft filling the space between them, until Chloe noticed something else, something that made her blink again, slower this time, taking in her surroundings properly, because this was not the same seat, not the cramped row she remembered, not the narrow armrest digging into her side, but wider, quieter, the lighting softer, the space around them noticeably more open, and she frowned slightly, confusion knitting her brows as she glanced toward the aisle, then back at him. "Wait, this is not," she hesitated, unsure how to phrase it without sounding completely lost. "This is not economy, is it?" And for the first time, something close to a smile touched his expression, subtle but unmistakable. "No," he said simply, and Chloe straightened a little, her heart skipping as the realization settled in. "How did I get here?" she asked, her voice lower now, almost cautious, as if she was afraid of the answer, and he met her gaze without hesitation. "You were struggling back there," he replied. "It was easier to move you than wake you." And Chloe stared at him, trying to process the simplicity of what he had just said, as if moving a sleeping stranger and her baby across a plane was the most natural solution in the world, and she shook her head slightly, still not quite believing it. "You did not have to do that," she said, and he shrugged. A small, almost dismissive motion. "I know." And that was it. No grand explanation, no attempt to make it sound like anything more than a choice he made in the moment. And Chloe felt something shift quietly inside her chest, something unfamiliar, something that did not come with strings or conditions, just ease, and she looked down at Lily again, noticing then the small details she had missed in her panic, the soft blanket wrapped around her daughter that had not been there before, the tiny jacket draped gently over her legs, and her throat tightened slightly as she reached out to adjust it, her fingers brushing the fabric. "This is not ours," she murmured, more to herself than to him, and he followed her gaze briefly before answering. She looked cold, and Chloe nodded slowly, her hand lingering for a second longer than necessary before she pulled it back, her eyes stinging faintly as she forced a small smile. "Thank you," she said, the words quiet but genuine, and he inclined his head once in acknowledgement, as if gratitude was not something he expected, as if helping had never been about being thanked, and the silence that followed was different now, not tense, not filled with unspoken discomfort, but steady, almost safe, until a voice broke through it, polished and respectful. "Mr. Walker, we will be landing in about 20 minutes. And Chloe's head turned sharply toward the aisle, her eyes flicking between the flight attendant and the man beside her, the name echoing in her mind, familiar in a way she could not immediately place. And when she looked back at him, really looked this time, she saw it, the details she had missed before, the watch that was not just expensive but deliberate, the way the staff spoke to him with quiet deference, the composure that was not learned but lived, and something in her expression must have changed because he met her gaze again, calm as ever. "Ethan Walker," he said, as if introducing himself properly now mattered, and Chloe's breath caught recognition, finally clicking into place, the name tied to articles she had read, to the company she had applied to just days ago, to a world so far removed from hers it might as well have been another country, and she felt the distance between them all at once, sharp and undeniable. But before she could say anything, before she could apologize again or retreat into the careful politeness she had built around herself, he spoke first, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "You looked like you had not been taken care of in a long time." And the words landed somewhere deep, not as an insult, not as pity, but as something far more unsettling, because they were true, and Chloe blinked, her vision blurring slightly as she looked down at her daughter, at the quiet proof of everything she had been carrying alone, and for a moment she did not trust her voice enough to respond, so she just nodded, once, small, and almost imperceptible, while the plane began its slow descent, the ground rising to meet them. And somewhere between the sky and whatever waited below, Chloe Bennett realized that this flight had already changed something she could not yet name. The moment the wheels touched the runway, a soft jolt ran through the cabin, and Chloe felt it in her chest more than anywhere else, like reality catching up after something unreal, and for a second she stayed still, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the blanket wrapped around Lily, as if moving too quickly might break whatever fragile calm had settled between them. And beside her Ethan shifted just enough to adjust the baby in his arms, careful, precise, like someone who understood exactly how much pressure was too much. And when the plane began to slow, the low roar of the engines easing into a steady hum, Chloe finally reached out, her fingers brushing Lily's back before she carefully lifted her from his arms, the warmth lingering for a brief second longer than expected, and Lily stirred slightly, but did not wake, her tiny face pressing into Chloe's shoulder as if nothing had changed, as if this entire moment had been just another quiet pause in a long night. And Chloe exhaled softly. "Thank you," she said again, the words carrying more weight now, less rushed, more certain, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady, as if he understood that this time she meant more than just the act of helping. And around them the cabin began to shift back into motion, seatbelts clicking open, overhead compartments unlocking, the quiet order of arrival replacing the suspended stillness of the flight, and Chloe felt it immediately, that familiar tightening in her chest. The return of everything she had managed to forget for a few hours, the job she did not get, the rent she still could not pay, the uncertainty waiting just beyond the aircraft door, and she adjusted Lily slightly higher on her shoulder, grounding herself in the small, steady weight of her daughter, because that part, at least, was certain, and as passengers began to stand, she remained seated for a moment longer, unsure if she should say anything else. Unsure if there was anything left to say that would not sound small compared to what had just happened. But before she could decide, Ethan reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a simple card, not flashy, not exaggerated, just clean and precise, and he held it out to her without explanation, and Chloe hesitated for half a second before taking it, her fingers brushing his briefly, and when she looked down at the card, her breath caught again, not from surprise this time, but from confirmation, because the name printed there was exactly what she had thought: Ethan Walker, Chief Executive Officer, Walker Group, the same name at the top of the rejection email she had read 3 days ago, the same company she had spent weeks preparing for, the same opportunity she had convinced herself might change everything. And for a moment she just stared at it, her mind trying to catch up with the coincidence, or whatever this was, and she let out a small, almost disbelieving breath. "I applied to your company," she said, the words coming out quieter than she intended, and Ethan's expression did not change, not in surprise, not in confusion, just a slight narrowing of focus as if he was placing the information where it belonged. "I know," he replied, and Chloe looked up sharply, her brows drawing together. "You know?" And he nodded once. "I saw your name," he said simply, "Chloe Bennett." And hearing her name spoken like that, calm and certain, made something shift again, because it meant this was not just a random encounter, not entirely, and she tightened her grip on the card slightly. "Then you also know I did not get the job," she added, a hint of self-awareness slipping into her tone. Not bitter, just tired, and Ethan watched her for a moment before answering, his voice even. "That decision was made before I saw you." And Chloe let out a soft breath that could have been a laugh if it had held more energy. "Of course it was," she murmured, more to herself than to him, and she glanced down at Lily again, smoothing a small wrinkle in the blanket as if it gave her something to focus on, something simple, because everything else felt complicated again, and the line of passengers began to move forward, the aisles slowly clearing, and Chloe knew she had to stand. Had to step back into the version of her life that did not include quiet strangers who moved her to first class or held her child like it mattered. And she shifted to her feet, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, the familiar weight settling back into place. And for a moment she just looked at him, unsure how to end something that had never really begun in a normal way. "I guess this is where I say goodbye," she said, her voice soft but steady, and Ethan stood as well, his height making the small space feel even smaller, but his presence remained the same, calm, contained, and he inclined his head slightly. "Goodbye, Chloe," he replied, and there was something in the way he said her name again that made it feel less like an ending and more like a pause, and she nodded, turning toward the aisle, taking a few steps forward before stopping, her fingers tightening briefly around the card still in her hand. Because something about walking away without saying anything else felt wrong, incomplete, and she turned back, just slightly. "Why did you help me?" she asked, not loudly, not demanding, just honest. And Ethan held her gaze for a moment, considering, before answering in the same quiet tone he had used all night. Because no one should have to do everything alone. And the simplicity of it landed deeper than anything else he could have said, and Chloe nodded slowly, as if she understood more than just the words, and then she turned again, this time continuing down the aisle, step by step, moving closer to the exit, to the bright lights of the terminal, to whatever waited on the other side. And as she stepped out of the aircraft, the cool air of the airport brushing against her face, she felt the weight of reality settle back in, but it felt different, not lighter exactly, but less suffocating, as if something had shifted just enough to let her breathe. And as she walked through the terminal, blending into the quiet flow of travelers, her phone vibrated softly in her bag, and she paused for a second before pulling it out, her thumb hesitating for just a moment before unlocking the screen. And when she read the message, her steps slowed, then stopped. Entirely, her heart catching in a way she did not expect, because the email subject line was simple, direct, and impossible to ignore: Walker Group Application Update. And Chloe stared at it, her breath shallow as she opened the message, her eyes scanning the first line once, then again, just to be sure she had not misunderstood, and for a moment the noise of the airport faded into the background, leaving only the quiet echo of one thought: something had changed. Chloe's fingers tightened slightly around her phone as she read the message again, slower this time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more familiar, something that made more sense. But they did not change, they stayed exactly the same, polite and precise and completely unexpected. We would like to invite you for a final review discussion regarding your application. And her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and hesitation, because just hours ago she had accepted the rejection as final, had folded it neatly into the part of her life where things simply did not work out. And now this, appearing out of nowhere in the middle of a crowded terminal where people rushed past her with rolling suitcases and quiet conversations, unaware that something small but significant had just shifted in her world, and she blinked, once, then again, her eyes flicking instinctively toward the direction she had come from, toward the gate she had just left, as if part of her expected to still see him there, standing exactly where she had last looked, calm and distant and somehow connected to this moment, even if she could not fully explain how. But he was gone. Of course he was, someone like Ethan. Walker did not linger in places like that, not when there were schedules to keep and meetings waiting and a life that moved at a pace she could barely imagine. And Chloe let out a slow breath, grounding herself, because whatever this was, whatever had changed, she was still here, still holding Lily, still carrying the same worn bag over her shoulder, and she needed to keep moving. So she slipped her phone back into her bag and adjusted her grip on her daughter before stepping forward again, merging into the flow of people heading toward baggage claim, her mind replaying the message over and over, trying to find the reason behind it, trying to understand if this was chance or something else entirely. And as she reached the carousel area, the familiar metallic hum filling the space, she found a spot near the edge and shifted Lily slightly, careful not to wake her, while her eyes drifted over the crowd, the tired faces, the quiet reunions, the small moments of relief as people collected their belongings and moved on. And for the first time in a long while, Chloe felt something unfamiliar settle beneath the exhaustion. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close, something that made her stand a little straighter, even if she did not fully trust it. And when her suitcase finally appeared, scuffed and unmistakably hers, she reached for it with her free hand, pulling it down with a practiced motion that spoke of doing things alone more often than not. And she turned toward the exit, following the signs toward the taxi rank, because she had already calculated the cost in her head, already decided she would take the cheapest option available, maybe even wait for a rideshare if it meant saving a few dollars, because that was how her life worked now, measured in small decisions that added up to survival. And as she stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against her face, she paused for just a second, taking it in, the distant sound of traffic, the soft glow of streetlights, the quiet reminder that the world kept moving regardless of what happened on a single flight. And she shifted Lily again, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's hair before moving toward the designated pickup area, her mind already returning to practical thoughts, to what she would do next, to how she would prepare for a conversation she had not expected to have. And she had just reached the edge of the curb when her phone vibrated again, a soft, persistent buzz against her side that made her pause, her hand moving almost automatically to retrieve it. And when she looked at the screen, she saw a new message. Not an email this time, not from a company address, but from an unknown number. And for a moment she hesitated, her thumb hovering just above the screen, because instinct told her to be cautious, to ignore it, to focus on getting home safely and dealing with everything else later. But something in her chest tightened slightly, something that felt too familiar to ignore, and she opened the message, her eyes scanning the short line of text. Do not overthink it. Just show up. And Chloe's breath stilled, her gaze fixed on the words as recognition settled in, not because of the number, but because of the tone, the same quiet certainty, the same absence of pressure or expectation, and she did not need a name attached to it to know exactly who had sent it. And for a second she simply stood there, the noise of the airport fading into the background again, her thoughts slowing as she let the words sink in, because they were simple, almost too simple, but they carried something she had not realized she needed: permission, not to prove herself, not to justify her situation, but just to be there, just to try again without the weight of everything that had come before. And Chloe exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just a fraction as she looked down at Lily, who remained peacefully asleep, unaware of the quiet turning point unfolding around her. And a small, almost reluctant smile touched Chloe's lips, not because everything was suddenly fixed, not because she believed everything would work out, but because for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was not entirely alone in it, and she slipped her phone back into her bag, her grip on the handle of her suitcase tightening slightly as she stepped forward toward the waiting line of cars, her pace steadier now, her mind clearer, because whatever happened next, whatever this opportunity became, she would face it, not as someone already defeated, but as someone who had been seen, even if only for a few hours, even if only by one person, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. The taxi ride felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because Chloe's mind refused to stay still, replaying every moment from the flight in quiet loops that did not quite make sense yet. The way Ethan had held Lily like it was natural. The way he had spoken as if exhaustion was something to be understood instead of judged, and most of all the message on her phone, simple and steady, echoing louder the more she tried to ignore it. And she sat in the back seat with Lily, resting against her chest, watching the city lights blur past the window in long streaks of gold and white. The driver humming softly to a radio station she did not recognize, and for a while she said nothing, just held her daughter a little closer as if anchoring herself to something real, because everything else felt like it could disappear if she questioned it too much. And when the car finally turned into her street, quieter and dimmer than the main roads, she felt the familiar tightening return, the reality she knew too well waiting for her at the end of it, the small unit, the overdue bills, the silence that came after a long day with no one to share it with. And she paid the driver carefully, counting each note twice before handing it over, her movements automatic, practiced, and when she stepped out onto the pavement, the cool air wrapped around her again, sharper this time, grounding, and she stood there for a second, looking up at the building that had become both her shelter and her reminder of everything she was trying to hold together, before shifting Lily slightly and walking inside, the hallway lights flickering faintly as she passed, the quiet hum of the building settling around her. And by the time she reached her door, her thoughts had already moved ahead to tomorrow, to the message, to the possibility she did not quite trust yet, and she unlocked the door carefully, stepping inside with the kind of quiet that came from months of moving around a sleeping child, setting her bag down gently before placing Lily in the small cot near the window, adjusting the thin blanket around her with soft, deliberate movements. And for a moment she just stood there, watching her daughter breathe, steady and peaceful, and it was only then that Chloe allowed herself to sit, lowering onto the edge of the worn couch with a slow exhale, her body finally catching up with the exhaustion she had been carrying, and she closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, but her phone vibrated again in her hand, pulling her back before she could drift too far, and she looked down at the screen, her thumb hovering for a moment before opening the email again, reading it from the beginning this time, every word, every line, as if searching for something hidden between them, but there was nothing complicated about it. No conditions, no elaborate explanation, just a time, a place, and a request for her to attend, and she leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling as she let it settle, because this was real, whether she understood it or not, and the question now was not why it had happened, but what she would do with it. And Chloe let out a slow breath, her hand tightening slightly around the phone as she thought about everything that could go wrong, about walking into a room where she did not belong, about being seen again and found lacking, about hoping and having that hope taken away just as quickly. And for a moment, the familiar instinct to step back, to protect herself by not trying at all, crept in quietly. But then another thought followed, softer but steadier. The memory of a voice that had not judged, that had not rushed her, that had simply told her to show up. And she opened her eyes again, her gaze sharpening just a fraction as she looked down at Lily, and something inside her shifted, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just enough to push her forward instead of holding her back, and she nodded once, to no one but herself, a small, silent decision forming in the quiet of her living room, and she reached for her bag, pulling out the folder she had nearly thrown away after the rejection, smoothing the edges carefully as she placed it on the small table. And for the next hour she worked quietly, reviewing her notes, adjusting details, preparing in the only way she knew how, because if she was going to walk into that building again, she would not do it halfway. She would not let exhaustion or doubt define the outcome before it even began. And when she finally stopped, the room had grown quieter, the city outside settling into the deeper stillness of night, and Chloe stood slowly, stretching slightly before moving to check on Lily one more time, her hand resting gently on her daughter's back as she watched her sleep. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel it. Not certainty, not confidence, but something close to determination, something that had been buried under months of surviving instead of living. And she leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to Lily's forehead, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We are going to try. Again." And this time, the words did not feel impossible. They felt necessary. And as she turned off the light and moved toward the bedroom, the quiet of the night no longer felt as heavy as it had before. Because even though nothing around her had changed yet, something inside her had, and sometimes, that was where everything began. The morning came too quickly, not because the hours were short, but because Chloe had not truly rested, her mind staying half awake through the night, replaying possibilities in quiet loops that never fully settled. And when the first light slipped through the thin curtains, soft and pale against the worn walls, she opened her eyes with a steady inhale, not refreshed, but ready. And for a moment she lay still, listening to the quiet rhythm of Lily's breathing from the cot beside the window, grounding herself before the day began. Because today was not just another day of getting through. Today carried something else, something uncertain but important, and she pushed herself up slowly, careful not to wake her daughter, moving through the small space with practiced efficiency, boiling water, preparing a simple breakfast, laying out the only outfit she had that still felt professional enough. A soft blouse and tailored trousers she had worn to the first interview, pressed as neatly as she could manage. And as she dressed, her movements were precise, deliberate, as if each small action helped steady the thoughts trying to rush ahead. And she caught her reflection briefly in the small mirror by the door, pausing for a second, not to admire but to assess, to make sure she looked composed enough to step into a place that did not naturally belong to her. And she adjusted a loose strand of hair behind her ear before turning away, because there was no time to second guess, not today. And when Lily stirred, soft and restless, Chloe moved immediately, lifting her gently, murmuring something quiet and soothing as she fed her, the familiar routine anchoring her again, reminding her of what mattered beyond any interview or opportunity. And by the time they stepped outside, the air carried the cool edge of early morning, the kind that sharpened your senses and made everything feel a little more real. And Chloe held Lily close as she walked toward the bus stop, her bag secured over her shoulder, the folder tucked safely inside, and she checked the time. Once, then again, calculating each step, each minute, because she could not afford to be late, not for this. And the bus arrived with a low hiss, doors opening to reveal the quiet, half-awake passengers already inside, and Chloe found a seat near the middle, settling Lily carefully against her chest as the city began to move around them. Buildings passing in steady rhythm, people stepping on and off, each one carrying their own version of a morning that mattered to them. And Chloe watched it, all without really seeing it, her thoughts turning inward again, to what she would say, to how she would stand, to how she would hold herself in a room where every detail might be noticed. And she repeated the message in her mind, not the email this time, but the one that had come after, the one that had not asked for perfection, only presence. And she held on to that as the bus turned onto a wider street, the skyline ahead rising gradually, glass and steel catching the early light in a way that felt both distant and inevitable. And when she finally stepped off, standing at the edge of the street with the building in front of her, she felt it again, that moment of pause, that quiet question of whether she truly belonged here. Because the Walker Group headquarters was exactly as she remembered, tall and precise, its entrance framed by polished glass and clean lines that reflected a world built on certainty and control. And for a second, she simply stood there, Lily shifting slightly in her arms, the weight both grounding and heavy. And Chloe took a slow breath, straightening her shoulders just a little, because turning away now would be easier, but it would also mean staying exactly where she had been. And she had already decided she was not going to do that. And so she stepped forward, each movement steady, measured, as she crossed the distance between the pavement and the entrance, the automatic doors sliding open with a quiet efficiency that felt almost symbolic. And inside, the space was calm, expansive, the kind of quiet that came from people who knew exactly where they were going. and Chloe felt the difference immediately, the contrast between her world and this one. But she did not stop. She moved toward the reception desk, her voice clear despite the tension in her chest. "I am here for a meeting," she said, giving her name. And the receptionist glanced at her screen before nodding with a polite smile that held no judgment, only recognition. "Of course, Ms. Bennett. Please take the executive lift to level 30. And Chloe nodded once, her grip tightening slightly on the strap of her bag as she turned toward the lifts, each step echoing softly against the polished floor. And when the doors closed behind her, enclosing her in the quiet space, she allowed herself one brief exhale, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored walls, and she met her own gaze for a second longer this time, not questioning, not doubting, just acknowledging the moment for what it was. And as the lift began to rise, smooth and steady, Chloe Bennett stood there with her daughter in her arms and something stronger than fear settling quietly beneath it, because whatever waited on level 30, she had already done the hardest part. She had shown up. The lift slowed almost too smoothly, the subtle deceleration barely noticeable except for the quiet shift in Chloe's chest as the numbers above the door climbed toward 30, and she adjusted her hold on Lily instinctively, her fingers brushing lightly against her daughter's back in a small, grounding motion that had become second nature. And when the doors finally opened with a soft chime, the space beyond felt different from the rest of the building, quieter, more deliberate, as if even the air carried a sense of control. And Chloe stepped out slowly, her eyes taking in the wide corridor, the muted tones, the glass walls that revealed offices arranged with careful precision. And for a moment she stood still, not out of hesitation but awareness, because this was not a place she had walked into before, not like this, not with everything on the line. And a woman approached from the far end of the corridor, her steps measured, her expression professional but not cold. "Ms. Bennett?" she asked, her voice calm and clear, and Chloe nodded once, shifting Lily slightly as she replied, "Yes," and the woman offered a small, polite smile. "I am Claire, Mr. Walker's assistant. Please come with me." And Chloe felt something tighten slightly at the mention of his name. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition, the quiet reminder that this was not just another interview. And she followed Claire down the corridor, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, each step echoing just enough to remind her she was moving forward. And as they passed by several offices, Chloe caught glimpses of people working behind glass walls, focused, composed, their movements efficient in a way that spoke of routine and expectation. And she wondered briefly what it would feel like to belong here, to move through this space without questioning every step. But she did not let the thought linger too long, because she had come here to earn something, not imagine it. And Claire stopped at a set of double doors, turning slightly toward her. "You can go in. They are expecting you," she said, and Chloe nodded again, her hand tightening just slightly on the strap of her bag before she reached for the handle, pushing the door open with a steady motion that did not betray the quiet tension beneath it. And the room inside was large but not overwhelming, designed with the same understated precision as the rest of the floor, a long table positioned near the center, a wall of windows stretching along one side, letting in natural light that softened the edges of everything. And 3 people sat at the table, their attention shifting toward her as she entered, their expressions neutral but attentive. And Chloe stepped forward, offering a small, polite nod. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady despite the faint tightening in her chest. And one of them, a man with silver at his temples, gestured toward the chair opposite them. "Please, have a seat." And Chloe moved carefully, adjusting Lily in her arms before sitting down, aware of the unspoken difference she brought into the room, the presence of a child in a space that was clearly not designed for one. And for a brief second, she wondered if that alone would be enough to end this before it began. But no one commented, no one showed discomfort. They simply waited, and that small absence of judgment steadied her more than anything else could have. And the woman seated beside the man leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "We appreciate you coming in again on such short notice," she said, and Chloe nodded. "Thank you for the opportunity," she replied, her hands resting lightly against Lily's back, her posture upright, but not rigid. And the questions began, not rushed, not aggressive, but precise, each one building on the last, asking about her experience, her decisions, the reasoning behind choices she had made in previous roles, and Chloe answered carefully, not trying to impress but to explain, her voice gaining steadiness as she spoke, because this part she understood, this part she had prepared for. And as the conversation continued, she noticed something shift, subtle but real, the way their expressions changed from polite interest to something more engaged, the way they leaned in slightly, listening, not just waiting for her to finish, and she felt it, that quiet alignment between what she knew and what they needed. And it gave her something solid to stand on, something beyond the uncertainty that had followed her into the room. And at one point Lily stirred, a soft movement that drew Chloe's attention for a brief second, and she adjusted her gently, murmuring something under her breath before continuing without apology, without interruption. And the moment passed naturally, as if it had always been part of the conversation. And then, just as the rhythm of the interview settled into something almost comfortable, the door opened again, not abruptly but with quiet intention, and Chloe did not need to turn to know who had entered. The shift in the room was enough, the subtle straightening of posture, the way the attention adjusted without breaking. And when she finally looked up, Ethan Walker was there, his presence exactly as she remembered, composed, steady, as if he had always belonged in this space. And their eyes met for a brief second, nothing exaggerated, nothing dramatic, just recognition. And then he moved to the head of the table, taking his seat with the same calm control, his gaze returning to the others before settling briefly on Chloe again. And he spoke, his voice even. "Please continue." As if his arrival changed nothing and everything at the same time. And Chloe felt the moment settle around her, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as something quieter, something that reminded her of the message she had read the night before, and she took a slow breath, her shoulders easing just slightly as she turned back to the panel, ready to continue, not as someone trying to prove she belonged, but as someone who had already decided she would not leave without being fully seen. The room did not shift loudly when Ethan sat down, but Chloe felt it anyway, a subtle change in the rhythm of everything, like a quiet note added beneath a melody she had just begun to follow. And for a brief second her focus wavered, her eyes flicking toward him before she pulled them back to the panel, grounding herself in the conversation that had not paused, that had not allowed her the luxury of distraction. And the man across from her continued, his tone steady. "Can you walk us through a time you had to make a decision without having all the information you needed?" And Chloe nodded once, her mind moving quickly, not searching for something impressive, but something real, something she understood, and she began to speak, her voice measured. "There was a point in my last role where we had to adjust a budget allocation mid-quarter without complete forecasting data," she said, her words clear, her tone even. And as she explained the reasoning behind her decision, the way she balanced risk and necessity, she felt the earlier tension ease just slightly, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing what she was talking about, from standing on something solid instead of trying to reach for something uncertain. And she did not rush, did not fill the space with unnecessary detail. She let the explanation breathe, let it land, and when she finished, there was a brief pause, not empty but thoughtful, and the woman on the panel nodded slowly, making a note before asking another question, building on the first, testing not just what Chloe knew but how she thought. And Chloe answered again, steady, focused, aware of Ethan's presence without letting it pull her away from the moment, because this was what she had come for, not him, not the coincidence of the flight, but the opportunity in front of her. And for the next several minutes the conversation continued like that, a steady exchange that felt less like an interrogation and more like a careful evaluation, each answer revealing a little more, each question opening a new angle. And Chloe remained present through it, her posture aligned, her attention clear, even when Lily stirred again, a soft movement that she managed without breaking the flow, her hand adjusting gently, her voice continuing without hesitation. And it did not go unnoticed, the quiet way she balanced both, the unspoken demonstration of something that could not be rehearsed. And then, just as the rhythm settled into something almost familiar, Ethan spoke, his voice cutting through the space not sharply but with a quiet authority that drew attention without demanding it. "Why did you reapply?" he asked, and the question landed differently, Not because of the words, but because of who asked them, and Chloe felt it immediately. The shift from structured responses to something more personal, more direct, and for a brief second she did not answer, not because she did not know, but because she understood that this answer mattered in a different way. And she met his gaze, steady, not defensive, not uncertain, just honest. "I did not," she said, her voice calm. And there was a flicker of interest across the table, subtle but present, and she continued. "I accepted the rejection," she added, her hand resting lightly against Lily's back, grounding herself in the truth of it. "But when I received the message asking me to come back, I chose to show up." And she paused briefly, not to create effect, but because that was where the thought ended. And Ethan's gaze held hers for a moment longer, measuring, not her words but the space behind them, and he leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable but not distant. And another member of the panel spoke, shifting the conversation again, asking about her long-term goals, her expectations, her ability to manage pressure in a fast-moving environment. And Chloe answered each one with the same steady clarity, not exaggerating, not minimizing, just presenting what was true, what she could do, what she had already done. And as the conversation moved toward its natural close, the tone shifted again, softer now, less about testing and more about understanding. And the man with silver at his temples folded his hands lightly on the table. "Is there anything you would like to ask us?" he said, and Chloe paused for a second, considering, because there were many things she could ask, questions about the role, about expectations, about the structure of the team, but none of them felt as important as the one that had been sitting quietly beneath everything else. And she looked briefly at Ethan before returning her attention to the panel, her voice calm but clear. "What does success look like here?" she asked, and the question settled into the room, simple but precise. And the woman on the panel responded, outlining expectations, performance measures, the usual framework. But Chloe listened beyond the words, listening for something else, something that could not be written in a job description. And when she nodded at the end, it was not just acknowledgement, it was understanding, and the man at the center of the table smiled slightly. "Thank you, Chloe," he said. "We appreciate your time." And Chloe inclined her head politely. "Thank you for the opportunity," she replied, her voice steady as she stood, adjusting her bag and Lily with practiced ease. And for a brief moment she hesitated, not out of uncertainty but awareness, because she knew this was the point where most things ended, with polite words and professional distance. But as she turned to leave, Ethan spoke again, not loudly, not to stop her, but enough to reach her before she stepped through the door. "Chloe," he said, and she paused, turning back slightly, her gaze meeting his, and he held it for a second, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. "You did not overthink it," he added quietly, and the words were simple, but they carried the same steady weight as the message from the night before. And Chloe felt it, that small shift again, that quiet reinforcement of something she had chosen without fully realizing it. And she nodded once, a faint, genuine acknowledgement passing between them, before she turned and walked out of the room, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the conversation inside, but taking something with her that had not been there before. The corridor felt quieter when Chloe stepped out, the door closing behind her with a soft, controlled sound that seemed to seal the conversation inside. And for a moment she did not move, her hand resting lightly against the strap of her bag as she let the air settle around her, her breath steady but deeper than before, as if her body was finally catching up with everything she had just held together. And Lily shifted gently in her arms, a small reminder that she was still grounded in something real, something immediate. And Chloe adjusted her slightly, her fingers brushing softly over her daughter's back before she began to walk, her steps measured, not rushed, because there was nowhere she needed to be right now except forward. And the hallway stretched ahead with the same calm precision it had before, but it felt different now, not as distant, not as intimidating, just part of the same path she had already stepped onto. And as she reached the lift, she pressed the button once, her reflection catching in the polished metal doors, and she looked at herself briefly, not critically, not searching for flaws, just acknowledging what had just happened, the way she had stayed present, the way she had answered without shrinking. And there was no dramatic shift in her expression, no sudden confidence replacing doubt, but there was something steadier beneath it, something quieter that did not need to prove itself. And when the doors opened, she stepped inside, the space enclosing her again in that familiar silence. And as the lift began to descend, the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly, not because the outcome was certain, but because she had done what she came to do. And that, in itself, mattered more than she had expected. And when the doors opened on the ground floor, the wider noise of the building returned, the movement, the voices, the rhythm of a place that continued regardless of individual moments. And Chloe stepped out, her pace unhurried as she moved toward the exit, passing the reception desk where the same woman offered a polite nod, one that now held a faint recognition, and Chloe returned it with a small, genuine smile before stepping outside, the daylight brighter now, the air carrying the steady hum of the city fully awake, and she paused for just a second on the pavement, adjusting Lily against her shoulder as she took in a slow breath, the kind that reached deeper than before. And she did not check her phone immediately, did not look for confirmation or answers, because she knew those would come when they came. And instead she started walking, her steps aligning with the steady flow of people moving along the street, each one carrying their own purpose, their own destination. And for the first time in a long while, Chloe felt like she was not just moving through it, but moving with it. And as she reached the corner, waiting for the light to change, her phone vibrated softly in her bag, the familiar sensation drawing her attention back, and she hesitated for a brief moment before reaching for it, her fingers brushing against the screen as she pulled it out. And when she looked down, she saw a message, not an email this time, not a formal notification, just a simple line from the same unknown number she now recognized without needing to think. Coffee, if you have time. And Chloe blinked once, her gaze lingering on the words as the noise of the street softened around her, and she glanced up instinctively, her eyes scanning the area without knowing exactly what she was looking for, until she saw him, across the street, standing just outside a small cafe, not hidden, not distant, just there, as if he had always been part of the next step. And he was exactly as she remembered, composed, steady, his presence unchanged by the shift in setting. And for a second she did not move, her mind catching up with the simplicity of the moment, because this was not part of the process, not something she had prepared for, and yet it did not feel out of place. And the light changed, the signal allowing the crowd to move forward, and Chloe found herself stepping with them, her pace unhurried but certain, crossing the street with Lily resting quietly against her, her focus narrowing just enough to keep her steady. And when she reached the other side, she stopped a few steps away, close enough to speak but not close enough to assume. And Ethan met her gaze, his expression calm, almost thoughtful, as if he had expected exactly this. And Chloe let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but close. "You always make things sound simpler than they are," she said, her voice soft but clear, and there was a faint shift in his expression, something that could have been a smile, subtle and brief. "They usually are," he replied, and Chloe shook her head slightly, her eyes dropping for a second before returning to his. "The interview," she began, her tone more grounded now. "Was that part of it too?" And Ethan considered the question for a moment before answering, not evasive, not direct in the way she might have expected, but honest in a different way. "You earned that," he said, and the words settled between them, simple but steady, and Chloe held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something more, something that explained the timing, the shift, the message. But there was nothing complicated in his expression, nothing hidden, just the same quiet certainty she had come to recognize, and she nodded slowly, accepting that answer for what it was. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the sounds of the cafe, the low conversations, the clink of cups, filling the space naturally, until Ethan gestured lightly toward the entrance. "You have time?" he asked, and Chloe glanced down at Lily, then back at him, her mind briefly running through everything she could be doing instead, everything waiting for her. And then she let out a slow breath, the kind that marked a decision made without overthinking, and she nodded once. "Yes," she said, and as they stepped inside together, the door closing softly behind them, Chloe realized that whatever came next, it was no longer just about the interview, it was about something else entirely, something she had not planned for, but had already begun to change the way she moved through the world. The cafe was quieter than the street outside, the sound of the door closing behind them soft but definite, as if marking a shift Chloe could not quite name, and she paused just inside for a brief second, her eyes adjusting to the warmer light. The low hum of conversation blending with the steady rhythm of coffee machines and clinking cups, and Ethan moved ahead slightly, not leading but guiding, his presence calm in a way that made the space feel less unfamiliar, and he chose a table near the window, not hidden, not exposed, just enough distance from the rest of the room to allow conversation without interruption, and Chloe followed, settling carefully into the chair opposite him, adjusting Lily in her arms with practiced ease, her fingers smoothing the edge of the small blanket instinctively. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence not awkward but measured, as if both were aware that this conversation did not need to rush. And a server approached briefly, and Ethan ordered without hesitation 2 coffees and a glass of water, his tone polite, familiar, and Chloe noticed the small details again, the way people responded to him, not with exaggerated attention but with quiet recognition. And when the server left, Chloe let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing just slightly as she looked across the table. "You did not have to do this," she said, her voice soft but steady. And Ethan met her gaze without shifting. "Neither did you," he replied, and the simplicity of it made her pause, her eyes dropping briefly to the table before returning to him. "I meant the interview," she clarified, her tone more grounded now. "The message, the second chance." And Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "It was not a second chance," he said, and Chloe frowned faintly, confusion touching her features. "Then what was it?" she asked, and he held her gaze for a moment before answering. "A different perspective," and Chloe let the words settle, turning them over quietly in her mind, because they did not sound like an explanation, not fully, but they felt closer to the truth than anything else she had considered, and she nodded slowly. "Because of the flight," she said, not as a question but as a recognition, and Ethan did not deny it. But he did not confirm it directly either, his voice remaining even. "Because I saw something that was not in your application," and Chloe felt that again, that subtle shift inside her chest. Not discomfort, not entirely, but awareness, and she looked down at Lily for a second, her fingers brushing lightly over her daughter's back, grounding herself before she spoke again. "And that was enough?" she asked, her tone quieter now, and Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "It was relevant." And Chloe let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, more an acknowledgement of how different their worlds were, how decisions in his could be made with a level of clarity that felt almost impossible in hers. And the coffees arrived then, the server placing them gently on the table before stepping away, and Chloe wrapped her hands lightly around the cup, feeling the warmth settle into her fingers, and for a moment she said nothing. Just let the heat ground her, let the quiet of the cafe hold the space between them, and then she looked up again, her gaze steady. "You do this often?" she asked, not accusing, not sarcastic, just curious, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly, a faint trace of something more human beneath the composure. "No," he said, simply, and Chloe nodded once, accepting that answer without pushing further, because she believed him, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. And the conversation paused again, not empty but reflective, until Ethan spoke, his tone slightly different now, less formal. "You handled yourself well in there," he said, and Chloe blinked once, the compliment catching her slightly off guard. "I answered the questions," she replied, her voice modest, almost dismissive, and Ethan shook his head faintly. "You stayed," he corrected, and Chloe held his gaze for a moment, understanding what he meant without needing further explanation, and she nodded slowly. "So did you," she said, and there was a brief shift in his expression, something almost like amusement, subtle but present. "That is my job," he replied, and Chloe shook her head slightly, a small smile touching her lips. "No," she said quietly. "I do not think it is." And the words settled between them, simple but carrying more than they appeared to on the surface, and Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze thoughtful, as if considering something beyond the conversation itself. And for a moment the noise of the cafe filled the space again, the low murmur of voices, the soft clink of cups, the rhythm of a place where life continued in small, ordinary ways. And Chloe took a sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading slowly, grounding her further, and she realized then that she was not tense anymore, not in the way she had been all morning, not in the way she had been for weeks, and it was not because everything was solved, not because she suddenly felt secure, but because for the first time in a long while, she was not carrying everything alone in that moment. And she set the cup down gently, her fingers resting lightly against the edge as she looked at him again. "What happens now?" she asked. Not about the interview, not exactly, but about everything that had unfolded since that flight. And Ethan met her gaze, his expression steady. "Now you wait," he said, and Chloe let out a quiet breath, nodding once. Because that part she understood, that part was familiar, and yet it felt different now, not like waiting for something to end, but waiting for something to begin. And she glanced down at Lily again, her daughter still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the quiet turning points unfolding around her. And when Chloe looked back up, there was a subtle shift in her posture, not dramatic, not forced, just a little more grounded, a little more certain, as if the space between who she had been yesterday and who she was becoming had quietly begun to close. And she lifted her cup again, taking another small sip, letting the moment settle without rushing it, because whatever came next, she was already in it. Chloe did not rush to leave the cafe, not because she had nowhere to be, but because for the first time in a long while, she was not being pulled in 10 different directions at once, and the moment felt steady enough to stay in just a little longer. And she noticed it in the small things, the way her shoulders remained relaxed even as Lily shifted softly in her arms, the way her mind was not racing ahead to the next problem before the current one had even settled. And across the table Ethan remained the same, composed, present, not filling the silence unnecessarily. And it was that quiet restraint that made the space feel balanced rather than overwhelming. And Chloe glanced down at her cup, the coffee now warm rather than hot, and she traced the edge lightly with her finger before looking up again, her expression thoughtful. "You said I would need to wait," she said, her voice calm but steady, and Ethan nodded once. "Yes," he replied, and Chloe held his gaze for a moment. "How long?" she asked, not impatient, just practical. And Ethan considered the question briefly before answering. "Long enough for the decision to be made properly." And Chloe exhaled softly, a faint smile touching her lips. "That sounds like a very careful way of saying you will not tell me," she said. And there was a subtle shift in his expression, something almost like acknowledgement. "It is a careful process," he said, and Chloe nodded, accepting that answer for what it was, because she understood processes. She understood that some things could not be rushed, even when everything in her life had taught her to move quickly or risk falling behind. And she looked down at Lily again, adjusting the small blanket slightly as her daughter stirred, then settled once more, and Chloe's fingers lingered for a second before she spoke again. "You saw something that was not in my application," she said quietly, returning to his earlier words, and Ethan's gaze remained steady. "Yes," he replied, and Chloe tilted her head slightly. "Not challenging, just curious. And you think that matters more than everything that was?" she asked, and Ethan did not answer immediately, his attention shifting briefly toward the window where the light had softened, the movement outside steady and constant, before he looked back at her. "I think it completes the picture," he said, and Chloe let the words settle, considering them carefully, because they did not dismiss her experience. They did not replace it. They added to it, and that distinction mattered more than she expected, and she nodded slowly. "Most people do not get the chance to show that part," she said, her voice quieter now, and Ethan inclined his head slightly. "Most people do not let themselves be seen that way," he replied, and Chloe held his gaze, understanding the difference, understanding that what had happened on the flight was not something she had chosen consciously, but it had been real, unfiltered, and that had changed something in the way she was being evaluated. And she leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture still relaxed but more reflective now. "So what happens if I do not get it?" she asked, the question simple but grounded in reality. And Ethan's expression did not shift. "Then you continue," he said, and Chloe let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. "That sounds very certain," she said, and Ethan's response came just as evenly. "It is," and Chloe shook her head slightly, a faint smile returning. "You make it sound easy," she said, And Ethan did not argue, did not correct her. He simply said, "It is not easy, it is necessary." And the distinction landed in a way that made her pause, because it removed the expectation of ease, replaced it with something more honest. Something she already understood, even if she had not put it into words. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet of the cafe filling the space again. And Chloe realized then that this conversation was not about convincing, not about persuading or proving. It was about clarity, about seeing things without the weight she usually placed on them. And she took another small sip of her coffee before setting it down, her fingers resting lightly against the cup as she looked at him again. "Why? Me?" she asked finally, the question not defensive, not insecure, just direct. And Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "Because you showed up when it mattered," he said, and Chloe felt the answer settle deeper than she expected, not because it was complex, but because it was not. It was simple in a way that left no room for overthinking, and she nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something she had been resisting without realizing it. And she glanced down at Lily again, her expression softening just slightly. "I did not have a choice," she said quietly, and Ethan's response came just as calmly. "You always have a choice." And Chloe looked back up at him, holding his gaze for a moment longer, and there was something unspoken in that exchange, something that acknowledged both the weight of her situation and the strength it required to keep moving through it. And she let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing again. "Then I guess I chose to be here," she said, and Ethan inclined his head slightly. "Yes," he replied, and for a moment the conversation settled into silence again. But this time it felt complete rather than unfinished, and Chloe shifted slightly in her chair, adjusting her bag as she prepared to stand, not because she wanted to leave, but because she knew she had reached the point where staying longer would not add anything more. And she rose carefully, balancing Lily with ease, and Ethan stood as well, his movement just as measured, and Chloe offered a small, genuine nod. "Thank you," she said, not just for the coffee, not just for the conversation, but for everything that had led to this moment. And Ethan returned the nod, his expression steady. "Take care, Chloe," he said, and she turned toward the door, stepping back into the rhythm of the street, the noise, the movement. But this time it did not feel as heavy. It did not press down on her in the same way. And as she walked away, her steps steady, her mind clear, Chloe Bennett realized that whatever the outcome of the interview, something had already shifted, not in her circumstances, not yet, but in the way she carried them. And that alone was enough to change what came next. The walk back to the bus stop felt different from the way she had arrived that morning, not because the streets had changed or the city had slowed, but because something inside Chloe had settled into a quieter rhythm, one that did not rush ahead or pull her backward, and she moved through the flow of people with a steadiness that felt new. Her steps aligned with something more certain than urgency, and Lily stirred lightly against her shoulder, her small breath warm and even, and Chloe adjusted her gently, her fingers brushing over the soft fabric of the blanket as if confirming that this, at least, was unchanged, constant. And as she reached the corner, waiting for the signal to cross, her gaze lifted briefly toward the glass facade of the building she had just left, the reflection of the sky stretching across its surface, distant and clear, and she did not linger on it, did not let her thoughts circle back into questions she could not answer yet, because she had already done what she needed to do, and the rest was no longer hers to control. And when the light shifted, she stepped forward with the others, crossing into the steady rhythm of the city, her mind quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar but welcome. And the bus arrived just as she reached the stop, the doors opening with a soft hiss that marked the transition back into her world. And she climbed on, finding a seat near the window, settling Lily carefully against her chest, her bag resting at her feet. And as the bus pulled away, the buildings began to pass again, not as symbols of something out of reach, but simply as part of the landscape she was moving through. And Chloe leaned her head lightly against the window for a moment, her eyes drifting closed, not in exhaustion this time, but in brief rest, the kind that came from having nothing immediate pressing against her. And when she opened them again, her phone remained still in her bag, no new messages, no updates, just quiet. And she did not reach for it, did not check, because for once she did not need to. And when she arrived at her stop, She stepped off with the same steady pace, the afternoon light softer now, stretching longer shadows across the pavement, and the walk to her building felt shorter than usual, the familiar path no longer heavy with anticipation or worry, just a series of steps leading home. And when she reached the door, she unlocked it with the same careful movement as always, stepping inside into the quiet space that held the shape of her life. And she placed her bag down gently, moving first to settle Lily into the cot, adjusting the blanket with the same soft precision, her fingers lingering for a moment before she stepped back, watching her daughter sleep. And the room was still, the kind of stillness that used to feel overwhelming, but now felt manageable, as if the silence was not empty, but waiting. And Chloe moved to the small table, pulling out her folder, setting it down without opening it, because there was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to fix or adjust. And she sank slowly onto the couch, her hands resting loosely in her lap as she let the day replay, not in fragments this time, not in scattered thoughts, but as a whole, from the moment she stepped onto the plane to the moment she walked out of the cafe. Each part connected in a way that made more sense now than it had when she was inside it, and she realized then that nothing about it had been random, not entirely, not in the way she had first assumed, and that thought did not overwhelm her, did not raise new questions. It simply settled, like a quiet acknowledgement that some things unfolded beyond what she could plan or predict. And her phone vibrated then, a soft, steady sound against the table, and Chloe looked at it for a second before reaching over, her fingers calm as she picked it up, her eyes scanning the screen. And this time it was an email, the subject line clear and unmistakable, Walker Group final decision. And her breath slowed, not catching, not rushing, just steady. And she opened it, her gaze moving across the words without hesitation, because whatever it said, she was ready to see it. And as she read, her expression did not change dramatically. There was no sudden shock, no overwhelming reaction, just a quiet stillness that settled deeper with each line. And when she reached the end, she let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing as she lowered the phone slightly, her eyes drifting toward Lily again. And for a moment she said nothing, did nothing, just sat there with the weight of the decision settling into the room, not heavy, not light, just present. And then, slowly, a small smile touched her lips, not wide, not exaggerated, but real. And she stood, moving toward the cot, her hand resting gently on Lily's back, her voice soft as she spoke. We did it. And the words were quiet, almost a whisper, but they carried everything that had led to this moment, everything that had shifted along the way. And as she stood there, the light from the window falling softly across the room, Chloe Bennett understood that this was not the end of something difficult. It was the beginning of something new, something she had chosen to step into even before she knew the outcome. And that was what had changed everything. The room felt the same, but Chloe knew it was not, because something inside it had changed, something invisible but steady. And she moved through the small space with a quiet awareness that had not been there before, her steps no longer carrying the same weight of uncertainty that used to follow her from one moment to the next. And Lily stirred softly in her cot, her small hand shifting against the blanket as if responding to the subtle change in the air. And Chloe leaned down slightly, brushing her fingers gently along her daughter's back, the gesture instinctive, grounding. And she stayed there for a second longer than necessary, not because she was afraid the moment would disappear, but because she wanted to feel it fully, the stillness, the quiet confirmation that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And when she straightened, her phone rested on the table behind her, the message still open, the words unchanged, but their meaning settling deeper with each passing second. And Chloe turned toward it slowly, picking it up again as if to make sure it was real, her eyes moving over the lines once more, not searching for errors, not questioning the outcome, just allowing herself to accept it. And there was no rush of overwhelming emotion, no dramatic release, just a steady, quiet understanding that this was the result of everything she had carried, everything she had chosen, even when it did not feel like a choice at all. And she set the phone down carefully, her gaze drifting toward the window where the light had shifted into the softer tones of late afternoon, the kind that made everything look calmer, more settled. And for a moment she stood there, letting the silence wrap around her, not heavy, not empty, just present. And she realized then that this was what it felt like when something ended the way it was meant to, not perfectly, not without effort, but with a sense of alignment that made the next step feel possible instead of overwhelming. And she moved back to the small table, pulling the chair out slowly as she sat down, her hands resting lightly against the surface, and she allowed herself to think forward, not in anxious loops, not in worst-case scenarios, but in simple, practical steps, what she would need to do, how she would adjust, how she would move from where she had been to where she was now going. And it did not feel impossible, not the way it used to. It felt like work, necessary, steady, manageable, and her phone vibrated again, the sound soft but clear against the quiet room. And Chloe glanced at it briefly before reaching over, her fingers calm as she opened the new message. And this time it was not formal, not structured, just a short line from a number she now recognized without hesitation. "You showed up." And Chloe's lips curved slightly, a small, genuine smile that carried more warmth than any reaction she had allowed herself earlier. And she typed back without overthinking, her response simple. "So did you?" And she set the phone down again, not waiting for another reply, because she did not need one, not in the way she might have before, and she stood, moving through the room with quiet purpose, gathering small things, adjusting details, not because she needed to prepare immediately, but because it felt right to begin, even in small ways. And as she folded a piece of clothing and placed it neatly on the chair, her mind returned briefly to the flight, to the moment she had fallen, asleep without meaning to the feeling of being held in place when everything else had felt like it was slipping, and she understood it differently now, not as a moment of weakness, but as a moment where she had allowed herself to stop carrying everything for just a second, and that had made room for something else to happen, something she could not have planned or forced. And she moved back to Lily's cot again, her hand resting gently on the edge as she watched her daughter sleep, her breathing soft and steady, and Chloe leaned down, pressing a light kiss to her forehead, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We are going to be okay." And this time the words did not feel like hope, they felt like truth, not because everything was solved, not because there would not be challenges ahead, but because she had already taken the step that mattered most. She had shown up, even when it was difficult, even when it was uncertain, and that had changed everything. And as she straightened, the room seemed to hold that understanding with her, the quiet space no longer something she had to endure, but something she could move within,